She saved herself for 20 years, humiliated at the altar in front of hundreds. But when the most powerful man in the country walked through those doors, no one was ready for what was about to happen. Where are you watching from? Hit subscribe and smash that like button, because this story will keep you hooked until the very last second. The first note resonated through the vast hall of Carnegie Hall like shattered crystal. Under the spotlights that caressed her slender silhouette, Eliza Bradford closed her eyes, letting her fingers dance across the keys of the ebony Steinway. This was the evening meant to consecrate 10 years of sacrifice and relentless discipline. In her midnight blue silk dress that shimmered like a starry sky, she resembled a living constellation, shining brilliantly under the gaze of 800 spectators who had come to hear her interpret Rachmaninoff. Fate never strikes at the moments we expect, but always when we believe we are finally safe from its caprices. The melody flowed from her fingers like a spring brook, pure and limpid, until that fateful measure, the 47th of Concerto No. 3, where her memory suddenly emptied, the void, the abyss. Her hands froze above the ivory keys, trembling like leaves in a storm. 3 seconds of absolute silence that seemed an eternity. Then 4, 5. The conductor turned toward her, his brows furrowed with concern. Sweat beaded on her forehead, icy despite the stifling heat of the spotlights. She resumed 2 measures later, attempting to mask her lapse. But the thread had broken. Her playing, once fluid and passionate, became mechanical, a body without a soul. In the hall, murmurs arose. She perceived the pained look of her teacher, Professor Thaddeus Hammond, in the 3rd row, and the merciless gaze of Curtis Thornton, the celebrated music critic whose sharp pen could make or break a career in a few lines. When she stood to bow, the applause was polite but without enthusiasm, that noisy silence that screams failure louder than any jeer. She smiled nonetheless, a tear trapped in the corner of her right eye, refusing to grant it freedom before all these witnesses to her fall. In the wings scented with polished wood and fresh flowers, Eliza leaned against a wall, her ragged breathing betraying the chaos reigning within her. At 28, after having dedicated her entire life to the piano since the age of 5, she had perhaps lost everything in the span of a few minutes of confusion. The next morning, the first rays of dawn filtered through the muslin curtains of her Manhattan apartment when Eliza opened her eyes. For one blessed moment, she forgot. Then reality hit her with the violence of an icy wave. The evening, the failure, the humiliation. She reached for her phone on the cherrywood nightstand and committed the fatal error, reading the reviews. "A monumental disappointment," headlined the New York Times. "The promising Eliza Bradford seems to have succumbed to imposter syndrome," announced another. But it was Curtis Thornton's column in the Musical Echo that delivered the fatal blow. Some artists are made only for small provincial venues where indulgence reigns and mediocrity can drape itself in the veil of pretension. Miss Bradford has just demonstrated that she now belongs to this category. Her phone vibrated. A message from her agent, Elliot Morgan. "Call me as soon as possible. We need to discuss what happens next." Next, as if a next was still conceivable. The phone rang again. Her mother, Margaret Bradford, former dancer with the American Ballet Theatre who had abandoned her career to raise her daughter and guide her toward pianistic excellence. "Darling," she began, in a voice that awkwardly attempted to conceal her disappointment. "I saw the reviews, don't worry, it's just a small bump in the road. You'll bounce back." A bump in the road. As if 23 years of hard work could be reduced to a mere hiccup. "Mom, I can't talk right now," Eliza murmured, her throat tight. "But you have to react. I've already called Elliot. We think a series of small concerts in New England could help you regain your confidence and—" "I said I can't talk," Eliza exclaimed, before abruptly hanging up. She remained motionless for a long time, staring at the ceiling adorned with antique moldings. On the wall across from her, diplomas from Juilliard and framed photos of her previous triumphs now seemed to mock her. First place at the International Geneva competition at 22, winner of the Clyburn Prize, special guest at the Aspen Festival last summer, all of it reduced to nothing by 3 minutes of disorientation. The doorbell rang, shrill. Eliza ignored it, but the visitor's insistence eventually made her yield. She quickly slipped on a silk robe over her nightgown and headed for the door, her eyes still swollen with tears. It was Elliot, her agent for 6 years, with whom she had patiently built her career. His usually jovial face was marked with worry. "You didn't answer my calls," he said, entering without waiting for an invitation. "I needed to be alone." "That's a luxury you can't afford today," he replied, placing his briefcase on the coffee table. "The Tanglewood Festival has just cancelled your recital." The news struck her like a slap. "What, but that's in 3 months." "Rumors travel fast, Eliza, and artistic directors are superstitious. One failure attracts others. That's what they think." She sat heavily on the couch, her hands trembling. "What do we do then?" Elliot pulled out a stack of papers from his briefcase. "We've received a proposal. Not exactly what we were hoping for, but the offer was 1,000 miles from her ambitions. A position as piano professor at a regional conservatory in the Berkshires. No stage, no audience, just students of varying talent and motivation. A performing career put on hold, if not permanently buried." "Is this a joke?" Eliza breathed, setting the proposal back on the table. "You want to exile me." "I want to save you," Elliot corrected. "Disappear for a while, let the storm pass. Keep working away from the spotlight and maybe in a year or two." "A year or two." Indignation made her voice tremble. "I'll be 30 in less than 2 years, Elliot. You know as well as I do that in this world, once you're past 30, if you haven't already broken through." He lowered his eyes, unable to deny this cruel truth of the classical music world, where youth was almost as important as talent. "The conservatory director is a respected former conductor, Warren Fletcher," he added more softly. "He heard your interpretation of Chopin's Nocturnes last year in Boston. He believes in your talent." A heavy silence settled between them, punctuated only by the regular ticking of the Art Deco clock on the marble mantelpiece. "I need to think," Eliza finally murmured. But deep down, she already knew she didn't really have a choice. Her savings wouldn't allow her to last more than a few months without income, and concert dates were cancelling one after another, like dominoes inexorably collapsing. A week later, Eliza watched from the train window as the landscapes that carried her away from New York and her shattered dreams rolled by. The urban landscape gradually gave way to vast agricultural expanses, then to the first signs of New England. Old maples, towering pines, fields as far as the eye could see. It was early September, and the vineyards were already donning their first autumn hues, creating a palette of reds and golds that would have seemed beautiful under other circumstances. In her bag, the scores she had brought, Chopin, Debussy, Schubert, weighed like lead. Would she ever play again for anything other than teaching children how to properly place their fingers on the keyboard? This question haunted her as the train sped toward her new life. The Berkshire train station was bathed in that particular light of New England that had inspired so many painters. On the platform, a man in his 60s was waiting for her, his face weathered by the sun, his grey hair cropped short. He held a small sign with her name simply written on it. "Miss Bradford?" he asked when she approached. "Warren Fletcher. Welcome to the Berkshires." His voice was warm, his accent slightly tinged with that New England musicality that softened consonants. No pity in his gaze, no unhealthy curiosity, just a calm benevolence that took her by surprise. "Thank you for coming to get me," she replied with distant politeness. "I've prepared a small apartment for you, a short walk from the conservatory. Nothing luxurious, but there's a grand piano, a Mason and Hamlin that I had specially tuned for your arrival." This attention touched her more than she would have liked. A Mason and Hamlin, not a simple upright piano as she had expected. Perhaps this exile wouldn't be as terrible as she had imagined. The apartment was indeed modest but charming, nestled under the roof of an old Victorian house on Maple Street in the heart of the historic centre. A small terrace overlooked the red and orange maple trees and distant church spires. The interior was bathed in light, with walls painted in off-white that reflected the New England sun. But it was the piano that dominated the living room, a magnificent Mason and Hamlin BB in black, whose majestic presence seemed almost incongruous in this modest space. Eliza brushed the ivory keys with her fingertips, without pressing down, as if she feared awakening a painful memory. It had been exactly 16 days since she had played, the longest silence in her life since she had placed her child's hands on a keyboard. "I'll leave you to settle in," said Warren, depositing her suitcases in the entryway. "Classes start on Monday. You'll have 4 students to begin with, all in advanced studies." She nodded. unable to formulate sincere thanks for what still seemed to her a humiliating demotion. Once alone, Eliza opened the windows to let in the warm air perfumed with maple and spices rising from the small square below. Life seemed so simple here, so far from the New York pressure. On the little square, elderly men played chess, their laughter rising to her, accompanied by the metallic clinking of pieces being moved. A cafe terrace vibrated with animated conversations. A street violinist played a gypsy melody that mingled with the sounds of the town. This carefree atmosphere suddenly seemed unbearable to her. How dare they be so happy when her life had collapsed? She abruptly closed the windows and sat on the small couch, her gaze fixed on the piano that waited for her, patient and intimidating at the same time. "I can't," she murmured. The weekend passed, slow and painful. Eliza carefully avoided the piano, like one avoids the gaze of a betrayed lover. She wandered through the streets of the small town, anonymous for the first time in years, with no one to recognize her or whisper as she passed. She bought fruit at the farmer's market, sat at a cafe terrace with a book she couldn't manage to read, feigning a normalcy that was completely foreign to her. Monday arrived too quickly. The regional conservatory was housed in a former 19th-century mansion, all in golden stone and classical elegance. Warren welcomed her in the hall, where a portrait of young Mozart seemed to judge her with his precociously wise gaze. "Your first student arrives in an hour," he announced, handing her a file. Amelia Prentice, 17 years old, very gifted but terribly anxious in public. A bit like... He broke off, but the unspoken hung between them. "A bit like me, right?" Eliza completed with bitterness. "I was going to say like many young talents," he gently corrected. "Your office and classroom are on the second floor. There's a Yamaha that isn't too bad." She climbed the spiral staircase, her steps echoing on the marble worn by generations of students. The room assigned to her was bright, with high ceilings and surprisingly good acoustics. The piano was indeed of good quality, though it couldn't rival the Steinway at Carnegie Hall, nor the Mason and Hamlin waiting for her in her apartment. Amelia arrived at the exact time, a young girl with long brown hair and an intense gaze, clutching her sheet music to her chest like a shield. "Good morning, Miss Bradford," she said in a barely audible voice. "It's an honor to work with you." The irony of the situation didn't escape Eliza. This girl looked at her with the same admiration she herself had had for her mentors, probably unaware that her new teacher was a fallen star. "What are you preparing?" she asked, opting for an informal approach to try to ease the atmosphere. "Moonlight Sonata. Beethoven. Of course, the choice of all sensitive teenagers." "Show me." Amelia settled at the piano, nervously adjusted the bench, and began to play. From the first notes, Eliza felt something break within her. This young girl played with a rare sensitivity, an instinctive understanding of the work that far surpassed her still imperfect technique. There was in her interpretation a vulnerability, an honesty that brought tears to Eliza's eyes. When had she last played with such authenticity, without thinking about critics, expectations, her career? "Stop," she said suddenly, her voice broken. Amelia stopped, looking panicked. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Eliza replied, trying to control her emotion. It's very good. Just, technically, your left wrist is too rigid." "Look!" She approached, wanting to show the correct movement, and froze, unable to touch the keys. Her hand remained suspended above the keyboard, trembling, like that fatal evening at Carnegie Hall. "Miss Bradford, are you okay?" asked Amelia, concerned. "Yes, excuse me, let's try another approach." It went like this all day. With each of her 4 students, Eliza managed to theorize, to explain, but never to demonstrate. Her hands obstinately refused to play, as if they had developed their own will, a visceral fear of failure that blocked any movement. In the evening, she returned to her apartment, exhausted as if after a marathon. The Mason and Hamlin still waited, impassive and accusatory. She approached, lifted the lid, brushed the keys again, and the tears she had held back all day finally broke free, flooding her face and blurring her vision. For the first time since her arrival in the Berkshires, she sat on the bench and deliberately placed her fingers on the keyboard. But no sound came out. Her hands, once so sure, so expressive, remained paralyzed by an irrational terror. The silence that followed was more deafening than any wrong note. October had brought to the Berkshires that golden light that transformed the ochre facades into living paintings. Eliza had found a routine, quite different from her frantic New York life. Every morning she stopped at the Maple Leaf Cafe on Main Street, ordered a strong coffee and a pastry, and watched the town wake up, hidden behind large sunglasses and a book she pretended to read. That's where she first noticed him. A man in his 30s, always sitting at the same table, always with a sketchbook open in front of him. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face with marked features softened by eyes of an almost transparent blue under thick eyebrows. He invariably wore shirts with rolled-up sleeves that revealed muscular forearms covered in ink, not tattoos, but traces of his work, she understood later. That morning, 3 weeks after her arrival in the Berkshires, a sudden rain forced the customers at outside tables to take refuge inside. Eliza found herself constrained at a small table, and the man with the sketchbook headed toward her. "May I? All the other tables are taken," he asked with a slight accent that she couldn't immediately identify. She nodded, trying to seem absorbed in her book to avoid any conversation, but fate had other plans. "You're new to town, aren't you?" he asked after a few minutes of silence. Eliza looked up, irritated by this intrusion into her carefully cultivated solitude. "Is it that obvious?" "For someone who observes people professionally, yes," he replied with a smile that creased a dimple in his left cheek. "I've noticed you for 2 weeks. Always the same ritual, always the same distant look at the world, like a stranger observing a play without ever participating in it." This precise analysis caught her off guard. "Are you a psychiatrist?" she asked sarcastically. He laughed, a warm sound that seemed incongruous on this rainy morning. "No, a lithographer. My name is Nathaniel Palmer." "Lithographer," she repeated, momentarily distracted from her annoyance. "Like old posters?" "Among other things, yes. I run Palmer Studios near the church. Traditional stone printing, a technique almost as obsolete as—" He broke off as if he realized he was about to say something inappropriate. "As obsolete as classical piano," she completed with a bitter smile. "You can say it. I was going to say as obsolete as courtesy, but your suggestion is interesting," he replied, fixing her with a disturbing intensity. "Are you a pianist?" Eliza hesitated. For the first time since the incident, she had the opportunity to reinvent herself, to pretend to be someone else. "I teach at the conservatory," she said finally, opting for a half-truth. "Ah," he said, nodding. "So you're that pianist. Eliza Bradford." Her heart skipped a beat. Even here, she couldn't escape her reputation. "You read the reviews," she said, her voice tense. "No," he replied simply. "Warren Fletcher is an old friend. He told me about you, in a positive light," he added, seeing her expression. "He greatly admires your interpretation of Debussy." An awkward silence settled between them, broken only by the sound of rain drumming against the windows and the clinking of cups that the waitress placed on nearby tables. "For you should come see the studio," he said suddenly. "There's something I'd like to show you. I don't think that—" "Tomorrow, 3 o'clock?" he insisted, scribbling an address on a piece of paper. "It's a 5-minute walk from here." He placed the paper near her cup, gave her one last enigmatic smile, and left the cafe despite the rain that was still falling. Eliza stared at the piece of paper for a long time, torn between annoyance at such audacity and a curiosity she couldn't explain. Finally, she slipped it into her bag and paid her bill, determined to ignore this impromptu invitation. Yet, the next day at 3 o'clock sharp, she found herself in front of a wooden door on which a brass plaque soberly indicated Palmer Studios, Traditional Lithography. For an instant, she was about to turn back. What had she come looking for here? But an inexplicable force prompted her to knock. Nathaniel opened almost immediately, as if he had been expecting her. He wore an ink-stained apron and smelled of a mixture of turpentine and damp paper. "You came," he said, visibly satisfied. "Come in." The studio was a vast and luminous space, dominated by imposing 19th-century cast-iron presses. Lithographic stones of different sizes were aligned on wooden shelves, some blank, others engraved with complex designs. On the walls hung ancient and modern prints, creating a fascinating visual fresco. "What did you want to show me?" she asked, trying to mask her evident interest in this timeless place. "This," he replied, leading her to the back of the studio. There, soberly framed, was an antique lithograph depicting a young woman at the piano. The scene was bathed in a soft light, and the musician's face expressed an intense, almost painful concentration. "It's a work by Whistler," explained Nathaniel. "The Piano Lesson, 1871. The original is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, but I was fortunate to acquire this original lithograph during an auction in New York." Eliza contemplated the work, strangely moved by the way the artist had captured this intimate communion between the musician and her instrument. That relationship she herself had lost. "Why show me this?" she asked, her throat tight. "Because every time I look at it, I wonder what she's playing, what she's feeling, if the music liberates or imprisons her." These words struck her with unexpected force. It was precisely the question she had been asking herself for weeks. Had music, which had been her whole life, become her prison? "You'll never know," she responded, more harshly than she had intended. "She's not real." "All artists are real," he replied with quiet conviction. "Whether they exist on paper, on stone, or in flesh and blood, their emotions are authentic. Their struggle is too." Something in his way of speaking, in the intensity of his gaze, deeply troubled her. This man saw her in a way no one ever had before, not as a virtuoso, a brand, a product to sell on the musical scene, but as an artist in struggle. "You don't know me," she said defensively. "No," he admitted, "but I know that look, the one of someone who has momentarily lost their voice." The following days took on a different hue, as if the encounter with Nathaniel had slightly modified the spectrum of colors through which Eliza perceived the Berkshires. She continued her routine, classes at the conservatory, morning coffees, but her gaze now lingered on details she hadn't noticed before. The play of light on the facades of historic houses, the rustling of maples on Main Street, the animated conversations of locals seated at cafe tables. With her students, something had changed as well. Without yet being able to play herself, Eliza had begun to listen differently, no longer with the critical ear of a concert pianist obsessed with technical perfection, but with a new attention to intention, emotion, the sincerity of the interpretation. Amelia, the anxious girl, was making surprising progress under her guidance. One afternoon, after a particularly successful lesson, the teenager paused at the door. "Miss Bradford?" "Yes, Amelia." "Why do you never play?" she asked with that brutal frankness typical of adolescence. "Even just to demonstrate, you always use words, never your hands." The question, so simple, so direct, caught her off guard. "It's complicated," she finally replied. "Sometimes words are more precise." "But music says what words cannot express," objected Amelia. "That's what you taught me." Eliza remained silent, unable to respond to this youthful wisdom that so cruelly put her finger on her own contradiction. That evening she returned to Palmer Studios without warning. Nathaniel was alone, meticulously cleaning a lithographic stone by the light of a lamp that cast dancing shadows on the walls. He looked up when the bell on the door tinkled, and his face lit up with a smile. "I knew you'd come back," he said simply. "Really?" she replied, disturbed by this certainty. "And how could you be so sure?" "Because you're not the type to leave a conversation unfinished." He was right, of course. All her life, Eliza had been obsessed with completion, conclusion, resolution, in music as in existence. "Show me how it works," she said, pointing to the press. For the 2 hours that followed, Nathaniel patiently explained the complex process of lithography, how to draw on the stone with a greasy pencil, how to etch the surface with acid to fix the drawing, how to ink, then print. His gestures were precise, measured, inhabited by the confidence of one who perfectly masters his art. "It's a bit like playing a score," she observed as he turned the press handle with controlled force. "Every movement must be just right. Too much pressure and the paper tears. Not enough and the ink doesn't deposit evenly." "Exactly," he approved. "And like in music, you must accept an element of unpredictability. Each print is unique, with its small imperfections that make it alive." These words resonated with her in an unexpected way. Throughout her career she had sought absolute perfection, that ideal interpretation, as if music could be fixed in a moment of eternal precision. Wasn't that where her error lay? "Your turn," said Nathaniel, handing her a small blank stone. "Draw something." "I don't know how to draw," she protested. "It doesn't matter. Intention counts more than technique." Hesitant, Eliza took the lithographic pencil and began to trace lines on the stone. Without thinking, her fingers drew what vaguely resembled a piano keyboard, stylized, almost abstract. Nathaniel observed her work without comment, then helped her proceed to the next steps: acidulation, gumming, inking. When they finally lifted the paper from the press together, revealing the impression of her clumsy drawing, Eliza experienced a strange emotion. Not the pride she felt after a successful concert, but something more humble, more authentic. The simple joy of having created, with no other purpose than the pleasure of the gesture. "It's not very good," she said, contemplating the result. "It's sincere," replied Nathaniel. "And that's all that matters." When she left the studio that evening, her print carefully placed between two sheets of silk paper, something had loosened within her. A small crack in the wall she had built around her wound. "Come back whenever you want," Nathaniel told her at the door. "The studio is open to searching souls." She nodded, unable to express what she felt. That night, for the first time since her arrival in the Berkshires, Eliza approached the Mason and Hamlin with a different intention. Not to play, her hands weren't ready yet, but to listen. She opened the lid, pressed gently on a key, just enough to produce a sound, and closed her eyes, letting the note resonate in the silence of the apartment until it completely faded away. Then another note, then an interval, a minor third that vibrated in the air like a question without an answer. November brought to the Berkshires a dry cold that stiffened fingers and made the town stones more sonorous underfoot. Eliza had taken to visiting Palmer Studios 2 or 3 times a week, observing Nathaniel work, sometimes assisting him, gradually learning the secrets of this ancient art that demanded patience and humility. A strange bond had formed between them, made of comfortable silences and conversations that sometimes ventured into unexpected territories. Art, creation, the vulnerability of the artist before their work. Never did Nathaniel ask her to speak of her musical block, but his very presence seemed to invite her to consider her relationship with the piano differently. This nascent, indefinable relationship was abruptly interrupted by the arrival of Elliot, her agent, on a freezing morning in late November. He was waiting for her in front of the conservatory, elegant in his cashmere coat, incongruous among the New England buildings. "We need to talk," he announced without preamble. "I have a proposal for you." They settled in a small nearby cafe. Elliot pulled out documents from his briefcase with feverish gestures that betrayed his excitement. "The Aspen Winter Festival," he said, pushing a preliminary contract toward her. "They have a cancellation for their Christmas concert. They want you, Eliza. It's your chance to return to the spotlight." She stared at the document, incredulous. The Aspen Winter Festival was one of the most prestigious events in the European musical calendar. "Why me?" she asked, suspicious. "After what happened." "Because their artistic director was in Boston last year when you played Chopin's Nocturnes. He says it was one of the most moving interpretations he's ever heard." Eliza suddenly felt nauseous. The idea of getting back on stage, of exposing herself again to the judgment of the public and critics, awakened the terror that had been dormant within her. "I can't," she murmured. "I don't play anymore, Elliot. I don't touch the piano." "What do you mean you don't play anymore?" he asked, incredulous. "You teach at a conservatory." "I teach theory, analysis. I don't touch the piano anymore." Elliot stared at her, stunned. "You're kidding. It's been 2 months, Eliza. You can't let one failure destroy 23 years of work." "It wasn't a simple failure," she replied, her voice trembling. "It was a public humiliation, and every time I try to play, my hands, they refuse. As if they've developed their own traumatic memory." "That's ridiculous," Elliot cut in. "You need professional help, not to hide in this provincial town. Come back to New York. I have the right contacts, sports psychologists, hypnotherapists, whatever it takes. We'll get you back on your feet." His condescension awakened in her an anger she hadn't suspected. "Back on my feet? Like an injured racehorse they want to make run again so it can bring in money." "Don't be unfair," Elliot protested. "I've always had your interests at heart." "My interests or your commission?" she shot back. The silence that followed was glacial. Elliot slowly folded the documents and put them back in his briefcase. "I see these 2 months of exile have changed you," he finally said. "Not necessarily for the better. You have until the end of the week to give me your answer. After that, I can't guarantee the offer will stand." He stood up, leaving a bill on the table to cover their drinks. You're an exceptional pianist, Eliza, one of the best of your generation. Don't waste this gift out of pride or fear." After his departure, she remained seated for a long time, staring at her cooled coffee cup. Elliot's proposal represented everything she had always wanted: recognition, redemption, the possibility of resuming her career where she had abruptly interrupted it. Why did this prospect now seem more frightening than attractive? This question was still tormenting her when she went to Palmer Studios later that day. Nathaniel was working on an important commission, a series of lithographs to illustrate a limited edition of Emily Dickinson poems. He barely looked up when she entered. "You look troubled," he observed simply. It was the first time he had used the familiar form of address. This subtle change in their relationship suddenly seemed significant to her. "My agent came to see me," she explained, sitting on a stool. "He's offering me a concert in Aspen, a major concert." Nathaniel put down his pencil and looked at her attentively. "Is that what you want?" "It's what I've always wanted," she answered. But now, you're not so sure." She nodded, surprised by his perceptiveness. "I'm afraid," she admitted in a whisper, "afraid of failing again, afraid my hands will betray me." "It's normal to be afraid. Fear reminds us we're alive, that what we do matters." He approached her and took her hands in his, those hands that hadn't played a complete measure since that fateful evening in New York. His palms were rough, marked by his work, in striking contrast to the preserved softness of hers. "These hands are capable of miracles, Eliza. I've heard it. Warren made me listen to a recording of you playing Liszt's sonata. It was transcendent." "That was before," she said sadly. "Now they're empty." "Nothing is ever empty," he replied with quiet conviction. "Sometimes you just need to relearn how to listen." He led her to the back of the studio, where there was a small upright piano that Eliza had never noticed before, hidden under a cloth. "It belonged to my grandmother," explained Nathaniel, removing the dusty cover. "She played every evening after dinner. Nothing virtuosic, just simple melodies that lulled our childhood. The instrument was old, in aged mahogany, with keys yellowed by time. Nothing like the concert pianos she was used to." "I can't," she murmured, backing away. "Of course you can," he gently insisted. "Not for an audience, not for critics, not even for me. Just for yourself, to remind you why you began, before music became a job." He opened the lid, revealing the keys patinated by decades of use. Then he moved away, returning to his work at the other end of the studio, offering her the space and solitude she needed. Eliza remained motionless before the instrument, her heart pounding. Then slowly she sat on the bench and placed her fingers on the keys, feeling their texture different from that of modern pianos. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and let her hands decide. The melody that emerged wasn't Liszt or Rachmaninoff, or any of the virtuoso composers who had made her reputation. It was a simple American lullaby that her grandmother used to sing to her when she was a child. "Hush, Little Baby," with its 4 plaintive notes that evoked the moon watching over the sleeping world. The first notes were hesitant, almost inaudible. Then her fingers found their way, recovering the memory of a time when playing was just an innocent pleasure, without expectations, without pressure. At the back of the studio, Nathaniel continued his work, deliberately turning his back, offering her this moment of private vulnerability. When the last note died away, Eliza remained motionless, her fingers on the keys, astonished by what had just happened. She had played. Imperfectly, modestly, but she had played. Tears flowed silently down her cheeks, liberating. "Elliot leaves for New York tomorrow," she finally said, breaking the silence. "I'll tell him no." Nathaniel turned toward her, a smile on his lips. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she replied with a new conviction. "It's not my path. Not anymore." This decision, which should have seemed heartbreaking a few hours earlier, now appeared to her as the only possible one, a necessary break with what she had been to discover what she could become. Elliot's departure left Eliza in a paradoxical state, simultaneously freed from pressure and confronted with a vertiginous void. By refusing this concert that could have relaunched her career, she had deliberately turned her back on the identity she had forged since childhood. Who was she now, if she was no longer that prodigy pianist destined for the greatest international stages? This question haunted her, as December settled over the Berkshires, bringing with it a diaphanous winter light and temperatures that made the centuries-old maples shiver. The streets adorned themselves with Christmas decorations, twinkling garlands strung above Main Street, shop windows decorated with New England ornaments, smells of roasted chestnuts and mulled cider escaping from Christmas markets. In this festive environment, Eliza felt strangely detached, like a spectator of her own life. At the conservatory, she continued to teach, but her students sensed her emotional absence. Even Amelia, usually so receptive, seemed disconcerted by her lack of enthusiasm. One evening, as the church bells rang 6 o'clock, Warren Fletcher knocked on the door of her classroom. The last students had just left, and Eliza was distractedly arranging sheet music. "May I speak with you for a moment?" he asked, his face unusually grave. She nodded, suddenly worried. Warren sat on a chair across from her, his gnarled hands crossed on his knees. "Elliot called me," he began without preamble. "He told me about Aspen and your refusal." "It was my decision to make," she responded defensively. "Of course, and I respect it. But I get the impression that since then you've been elsewhere. As if by renouncing this concert you've also renounced any form of engagement." His words struck her with their accuracy. It was exactly what she felt. A deep disconnection, an abandonment not only of her career but of any emotional involvement. "I'm going through a difficult time," she admitted. "I'm not really sure who I am anymore, or what I want." Warren nodded with understanding. "That's normal. An artistic identity isn't reinvented in a few weeks, but you can't stay in this limbo indefinitely. Neither for yourself nor for your students." He pulled a brochure from his satchel and placed it on the piano. "The conservatory is organizing a faculty concert at the end of January. Nothing intimidating, just a moment of sharing with the students and their families. I'd like you to participate." Eliza stared at the brochure as if he had presented her with a venomous snake. "I can't," she murmured. "Not yet." "You played at Nathaniel's," he gently observed. She looked at him surprised. "He told you? We've been friends for 30 years. He genuinely cares about you, you know." She looked away, troubled by this remark and the implication it contained. "It was just a lullaby," she said to minimize the importance of that moment. "On an old out-of-tune piano." "It was a beginning," Warren corrected, "and every rebirth begins with a small step." He rose, signifying that the conversation was over. "Think about it. You have until mid-January to give me your answer. But know one thing, Eliza. What broke you in New York wasn't the failure itself. It was the fear of not living up to expectations. Here, there are no expectations, only hope." After his departure, Eliza remained motionless in the silent room for a long time. Warren's words resonated within her, exposing a truth she had always refused to see. Her obsessive quest for perfection, her constant need for validation, had transformed music, that art she loved more than anything, into a perpetual test of judgment. That night, she didn't go to Palmer Studios as had become her habit. Instead, she walked aimlessly through the town's streets, deliberately losing herself in the narrow lanes of the historic center, where the close-set facades seemed to whisper centuries-old secrets. The town was calm, the air cold and crisp. At a street corner she heard music, a violinist playing in a small restaurant, interpreting a melancholy gypsy air that escaped through the half-open door. She stopped to listen, hypnotized by this melody that spoke of nostalgia and wandering. The violinist played with a raw passion, without the technical perfection that would have been demanded in a concert hall, but with an authenticity that touched the heart directly. When he finished his piece, Eliza realized she was crying, the tears almost freezing on her cheeks in the glacial December air. Back in her apartment, she stared for a long time at the Mason and Hamlin that occupied her living room. The majestic instrument seemed to silently judge her, witness to her daily cowardice. On an impulse, she picked up the phone and called her mother, something she hadn't done for weeks. "Eliza," Margaret Bradford's voice expressed her surprise. "Is everything all right?" "No," she replied honestly. "I don't think so." There was a silence at the other end of the line. Then, with unusual gentleness, "Tell me." For nearly an hour Eliza talked, about her fear, her confusion, this feeling of being lost between two identities. She spoke of Nathaniel, of the studio, of that lullaby played on an old piano that had momentarily broken the spell. She spoke of the faculty concert and her terror at the idea of getting back on stage, even in such a modest setting. When she had finished, her mother remained silent for so long that Eliza thought the connection had been cut. "Mom, are you still there?" "Yes," Margaret finally replied. "I'm trying to find the right words. You know, when I stopped dancing to raise you, I went through something similar. That feeling of emptiness, of no longer knowing who I was." This revelation surprised Eliza. Her mother had never mentioned the difficulties of her transition from dancer to mother. "How did you overcome it?" she asked, suddenly eager to understand this woman she thought she knew. "By accepting that I wasn't defined solely by dance or by my motherhood, that I was more complex, more nuanced than these labels, and by understanding that each transition, each loss, opens us to new possibilities, if we accept to cross through the pain instead of fleeing it." These words, coming from this woman she had always perceived as rigid and demanding, profoundly moved Eliza. All her life she had believed that her mother valued only success, excellence, recognition. Discovering this dimension of vulnerability and wisdom in her deeply changed her perspective. "Will you come for Christmas?" Margaret asked after a moment. "Your father and I would love to see you." "I don't know," Eliza hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm ready to face New York." "We could come to the Berkshires," her mother proposed, with a spontaneity that surprised her again. "You would really do that?" "Of course. Family isn't just being together in moments of triumph, it's especially being present in moments of doubt." After hanging up, Eliza felt strangely lightened. The conversation with her mother had opened a breach in her armor of isolation. She wasn't alone in her abyss. Others had crossed similar deserts and returned transformed. For the first time in weeks, she deliberately sat at the piano, placed her hands on the keys, and played, not a complex piece, but simply a C major scale, slowly, listening to each note resonate in the silence of the apartment. The sound was clear, crystalline, alive. When she reached the octave, she felt something loosen within her. Not a complete healing, but the first thread of a tapestry beginning to be rewoven. The week before Christmas saw the Berkshires draped in an exceptional mantle of cold. A thin layer of frost covered the fountains in the early morning, transforming the town into a fairy tale landscape that the locals, little accustomed to such temperatures, contemplated with a mixture of wonder and concern. In the pedestrian streets, the vendors of chestnuts and mulled cider did a roaring trade, their stalls releasing fragrant wisps of vapor that dissipated in the frigid air. Eliza had resumed her visits to Palmer Studios, but something had changed in her relationship with Nathaniel. A subtle distance had been established, not a pulling away, but rather a respectful space, as if he sensed that she was traversing a delicate phase of her metamorphosis that required solitude and introspection. That day, entering the studio, she found him in the company of an elegant woman with short grey hair, whose bearing and gestures immediately betrayed a classical training. "Eliza," Nathaniel welcomed her warmly. "Let me introduce you to Gwendolyn Harrison. Gwendolyn, this is Eliza Bradford, whom I've told you about." The name made Eliza start. Gwendolyn Harrison was a legendary pianist, now retired from the stage, whose interpretations of Ravel and Debussy were referenced around the world. "Miss Bradford," said Gwendolyn, extending a hand with fine, nervous fingers. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Nathaniel has told me a lot about you." Eliza shot a questioning look at Nathaniel, who appeared slightly embarrassed. "Gwendolyn is an old friend," he explained. "She's come to commission a series of lithographs to illustrate her memoirs, and also to meet this young pianist, whom Warren and Nathaniel never stop praising to me," added Gwendolyn, with a mischievous smile, "even if apparently this talent is hiding at the moment." The frankness of the remark took Eliza by surprise. In another context, she would have perceived it as a criticism, but there was in Gwendolyn's gaze an understanding that disarmed her usual wariness. "Talent never really hides," she responded cautiously. "It transforms, perhaps." "Oh, what a beautiful formulation!" exclaimed Gwendolyn. "Can I use it for my memoirs, Nathaniel?" He laughed, visibly relieved by this positive first interaction. "It depends on what you plan to reveal in these memoirs," he teased her. "I'm wary of your revelations about the musical world." "Oh, it will be explosive," she promised with a wink. 50 years of career. I've seen and heard things that would make the statues at the Met blush." This unexpected lightness, This way of talking about the musical world without excessive reverence was refreshing for Eliza. From the beginning, she had considered this universe with an almost religious respect, like a temple whose priests, professors, critics, artistic directors held absolute power over her value. They spent the afternoon discussing the project of lithographs for Gwendolyn's memoirs. Nathaniel proposed a series of stylized portraits of the great composers whose works she had interpreted, interwoven with motifs evoking their music. Eliza found herself actively participating in the conversation, suggesting visual symbols to translate certain aspects of the compositions: broken waves for Ravel's Jeu d'eau, concentric circles for Debussy's preludes. "You have an eye," observed Gwendolen, examining the quick sketches that Eliza had scribbled. "This way of visually connecting musical motifs. It's exactly what I feel when I play these pieces." "I've always seen music in images," admitted Eliza. "That's how I memorize the most complex scores, by visualizing landscapes, colors, movements." "Synesthesia," nodded Gwendolen. "I've known several musicians who possessed this gift. It's precious, but it can also become a prison if one encloses oneself in it too rigidly." This remark touched a sensitive spot. Eliza had indeed constructed such a complex mental architecture around each work she interpreted that the slightest deviation, the slightest imperfection, upset the entire edifice, like that fatal evening at Carnegie Hall. Late in the afternoon, while Nathaniel had slipped away to retrieve supplies from the storeroom, Gwendolen turned to Eliza with a more direct gaze. "Now that we're between pianists," she said in a low voice, "tell me the truth. What prevents you from playing?" Eliza stiffened, caught off guard by this frontal question. "It's complicated," she replied, aware of the weakness of this excuse. "No, it's not complicated, it's terrifying nuance." Gwendolen smiled with compassion. "Believe me, I understand better than anyone. At your age, I went through a similar crisis. After a particularly disastrous concert in New York, I didn't touch a piano for 3 months." "How did you overcome it?" asked Eliza, suddenly eager to know. "By understanding that the greatest obstacle to my art wasn't in my hands, but in my head. I had created such a perfect image of what I should be as an artist that reality could never equal it. It was like living with a distorting mirror that constantly sent back an altered image of myself." These words resonated deeply with Eliza. Wasn't that exactly what she was experiencing? This obsession with corresponding to an idealized image, this inability to accept the slightest flaw in her performance. "And how does one break this mirror?" she asked in a whisper. Gwendolen smiled, a smile imbued with hard-won wisdom. "By accepting that true art doesn't reside in perfection, but in authenticity. By understanding that our weaknesses, our vulnerabilities, our very errors are an integral part of our unique voice." She paused, seeming to hesitate before continuing. "I saw a recording of your concert in New York, the one where I failed," completed Eliza, her throat tight. "No," Gwendolen firmly corrected, "where you showed your humanity. Do you know what I saw in that moment of silence, in that hesitation that traumatized you so much?" Eliza shook her head, holding her breath. "I saw an artist so emotionally invested in what she was playing that she momentarily lost her footing, not because of a lack of technique or preparation, but because of an excess of involvement. It's the pianist's paradox. We seek to transcend mechanics to reach pure emotion, but this emotion is sometimes so intense that it can overwhelm the mechanics." These words fell like beneficial rain on parched earth. Never had anyone presented her failure from this angle, not as a deficiency, but as an almost inevitable consequence of her search for the absolute. "Come see me tomorrow," Gwendolen suddenly proposed, scribbling an address on a piece of paper. "I've rented a house with a piano for the holidays. We could talk at greater length." When Nathaniel returned, he found the two women immersed in an animated conversation about the different schools of interpretation of Ravel, a subject that Eliza hadn't broached for months. So intimately was it linked to her previous life. Later, leaving the studio, she felt something new within her. Not yet a certainty, but a crack in the wall of doubts and fears she had erected around her musical practice. Gwendolen's words had opened a different perspective on her relationship with the piano, with failure, with excellence. That night, for the first time since her arrival in the Berkshires, she dreamed of music, not anguished nightmares where she found herself paralyzed on stage, but a clear, simple, and luminous melody that seemed to emanate from her own hands. The house that Gwendolen had rented for the holidays was situated slightly outside the town, on the heights of Stockbridge, with an unmatched view of the Berkshire Hills. It was a restored colonial, surrounded by century-old maples and pines that rose like dark sentinels against the winter sky. When Eliza arrived, brought by a taxi from the center of town, Gwendolen was waiting for her on the porch, wrapped in a cashmere shawl, a steaming cup in her hand. "Tea or coffee?" she proposed by way of welcome. "Or perhaps a mulled cider? It's freezing out." "Tea, thank you," replied Eliza, smiling at this immediate familiarity. The interior of the house was warm, decorated with a mixture of modern art objects and antique furniture. An immense bay window in the living room offered a spectacular view of the winter landscape. But what immediately drew Eliza's attention was the piano, a Steinway semi-grand placed near the window bathed in natural light. "They delivered it specially for me," explained Gwendolen, following her gaze. "I can't go more than 3 days without playing, even on vacation. It's like breathing." Eliza approached the instrument with a fascination mixed with apprehension. Her fingers brushed the polished wood of the lid, then withdrew, as if burned. "Sit down," invited Gwendolen, returning from the kitchen with a steaming cup of tea. "We have a lot to say to each other, you and I." They settled in comfortable armchairs facing the bay window. For a moment, they contemplated the landscape in silence. The Berkshire Hills, whose imposing mass constantly changed color under the play of winter light, passing from ochre to pale blue, then to violet as ragged clouds drifted across the sky. "Did you know that Winslow Homer painted these hills more than 80 times?" Gwendolen suddenly asked. "Always the same subject, but never the same canvas. The different light, the different angle, his different state of mind." Eliza nodded, intrigued by this apparently off-topic observation. "It's a bit like playing Chopin all your life," continued Gwendolen. "The same notes on the score, but never the same interpretation. What makes the greatness of an artist isn't their ability to achieve technical perfection. Any good conservatory student can get there with enough work. It's their ability to see, to hear, to feel differently, to bring something unique, something that comes from the depths of their being." She turned toward Eliza, her gaze suddenly more intense. "Your problem, my dear, is that you've stopped listening to yourself. You hear only external voices, critics, professors, agents, the public. These voices have ended up covering your own until you no longer know why you play." The precision of this analysis struck Eliza like a revelation. Wasn't that exactly what had happened? This obsession with external expectations, this constant fear of judgment, had progressively stifled her inner voice, her pure pleasure in playing. "How do you know all this?" she asked, troubled. Gwendolen smiled, a smile in which could be read a lifetime of experience. "Because I almost lost myself in the same way. At 30 I was like you, obsessed with perfection, terrified of failure, unable to play without constantly thinking about what others would say. I had become the interpreter of my own anxiety more than of the music." She rose and moved toward the piano, opened it with a gesture of almost maternal tenderness. "And then I met Vladimir Horowitz. I was in New York for a masterclass, and he heard me practicing. Afterwards, he told me something I've never forgotten. 'My child, you play all the notes perfectly. Now it would be time to play the music.' She sat at the piano and without warning began to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the most well-known and most played pieces in the repertoire. But under her fingers, this work that Eliza had heard hundreds of times seemed to be reborn, as if she were discovering it for the first time. There was in her interpretation a freedom, a breath, a humanity that transcended simple technical execution. When the last note died away, Gwendolen turned toward Eliza, whose eyes shone with contained tears. "What did you hear?" she asked gently. "Life," replied Eliza in a breath. "I heard life." Gwendolen smiled, satisfied. "That's what's missing from your playing, my dear. Not technique. You have that, and remarkably so. Not musical intelligence. Your analyses are brilliant. What's missing is life, your voice, your breath." She patted the bench beside her, inviting Eliza to join her. "Come, play something for me. Anything, a fragment, a simple melody, whatever you want." Eliza hesitated, then slowly approached, as if drawn despite herself to the instrument. She sat beside Gwendolen, feeling the warmth of her body, breathing her discreet perfume with notes of jasmine. "I don't know if I can," she murmured. "Of course you can," replied Gwendolen with quiet confidence. "But this time don't play for me. Don't play for an imaginary audience. Play for yourself. Play to hear your own voice." Eliza placed her hands on the keyboard, feeling under her fingers the familiar resistance of the ivory keys. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and let the music come. Not a virtuoso work from the classical repertoire, but a simple melody she had composed as a teenager, almost forgotten, that came back to her now like a childhood memory. The first notes were hesitant, clumsy. Then her fingers recovered the memory of the movement, and the melody unfolded, a little melancholy waltz with impressionist harmonies that evoked the Monet paintings she had so loved as a teenager. When she stopped, Gwendolen remained silent for a long time, as if to give the music time to resonate in the space. "Is it yours?" she finally asked. Eliza nodded, suddenly embarrassed by the simplicity of the piece. "It's the first thing I composed at 14. It's not very original, I know. You can hear too much influence of Debussy and Satie." "It's sincere," corrected Gwendolen. "And that's all that matters. Do you remember why you composed it?" Eliza searched her memory, finding the recollection of that solitary adolescent who found refuge in music. "It was after a visit to the Museum of Fine Arts," she explained. "I had spent hours in front of Monet's water lilies. Coming back, I tried to translate into music what I had felt. This impression of floating, of colors dissolving into each other, of suspended time." "And why have you never played it in public?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't know. I suppose I didn't think it was good enough. Not impressive enough. Not enough in conformity with what others expected of you," completed Gwendolen. "That's the heart of the problem, Eliza. You've spent your life playing for others, never for yourself, interpreting the works you were told to play, in the way you were told to play them, conforming to a prefabricated image of what a classical pianist should be." She rose, approached the bay window, contemplating the Berkshire Hills that were aflame in the twilight light. "That's why your failure in New York was so devastating. It wasn't just a technical or memory lapse. It was the crack in a mask you had been wearing for too long." These words struck Eliza with the force of a revelation. Wasn't that precisely what she had felt on stage that evening? That moment of absolute panic when suddenly she no longer knew who she was or why she was playing. "So, how do I find my voice again?" she asked in a breath. Gwendolen turned, her face illuminated by the last rays of the sun that traversed the bay window. "By starting at the beginning. By remembering what made you love music before it became a career, an obligation, a prison. By listening to your inner voice before any other." She returned to the piano, placed a light hand on Eliza's shoulder. "The faculty concert that Warren told me about. It's a perfect opportunity. No critics, no career stakes, just a moment of sharing, of communion with music and those who love it." Eliza felt a shiver run through her, a mixture of fear and excitement at this prospect. "What would I play?" she asked, realizing that she was seriously considering this possibility for the first time. Gwendolen smiled, a smile in which could be read a deep satisfaction. "Start with what you just played for me. Your composition. Then perhaps a piece that you love deeply, that you play for pleasure, not to impress. Something that speaks to your heart." She paused, seeming to hesitate before adding, "And perhaps you could invite this young man, Nathaniel, to listen to you practice. He seems to care a lot about you." Eliza blushed, caught off guard by this observation. "We're just friends," she protested weakly. "Of course," replied Gwendolen with an enigmatic smile. "Like Bach and his keyboard, like Chopin and his piano. Just friends." That evening, returning by taxi to the center of town, Eliza felt strangely light, as if a weight she had carried for years had been lifted. Gwendolen's words resonated within her, opening perspectives she had never considered. What if her career as she had conceived it was just one of the possible paths and not the only one? What if the failure in New York, far from being an end, was just the beginning of a necessary transformation? The town sparkled with 1,000 lights in the clear night. Christmas garlands illuminated shop windows, cafe terraces where people crowded to escape the cold. For the first time in months, Eliza looked at this spectacle with a sense of belonging. She was no longer simply an exile, a fallen one awaiting redemption. She was beginning to glimpse the possibility of another life, another relationship with music, more authentic, more personal, perhaps less glorious by conventional standards, but infinitely truer. Passing by Palmer Studios, she noticed that the light was still on despite the late hour. Without thinking, she had the taxi stop and got out, driven by an impulse she didn't try to analyze. The door to the studio wasn't locked. Eliza entered softly, welcomed by the familiar smell of ink, damp paper, and solvents. Nathaniel was bent over a lithographic stone, so absorbed in his work that he didn't hear her immediately. She observed him in silence for a moment, struck by his total concentration, the precision of his gestures, this perfect communion between the artist and his work that reminded her of what she herself had once felt at the piano. "Nathaniel?" she called softly. He started slightly, then smiled as he recognized her. "Eliza, I wasn't expecting you tonight. I was coming back from Gwendolyn's and saw the light. How was your day with her?" he asked, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Transformative," she replied simply. "She made me understand things I might never have grasped on my own." He nodded, as if he had expected this. Gwendolyn has that gift. She sees beyond appearances, defenses, right to the heart. A comfortable silence settled between them, punctuated only by the regular ticking of the old wall clock that dominated the studio. Eliza approached the stone he was working on, discovering with surprise that it was a series of portraits, hers captured in different emotional states. There was Eliza pensive at the cafe, Eliza concentrated in front of a score, Eliza laughing at a joke. "You've drawn me," she murmured, moved by the evident tenderness with which he had captured her expressions. "I hope you don't mind," he replied, suddenly almost shy. "It's for a personal project. I wanted to capture this transformation I was seeing take place in you day by day, this rebirth." The word struck her with its accuracy. It was indeed what she was going through, not a simple healing but a true rebirth, a return to the very essence of what she was, beyond the layers of conventions and expectations that had stifled her. "I've decided to participate in the faculty concert," she suddenly announced. Nathaniel's face lit up. "That's wonderful news. What decided you?" "Gwendolyn made me understand that I needed to start playing for myself again, not for others. To find my own voice." She paused, hesitant, then added, "I'd like you to listen to me practice, not as a critic or a professor, just as someone who hears me." He put down his lithographic pencil and approached her, looking at her with an intensity that troubled her. "I'd love to hear you," he said simply. "Since I met you, I've been trying to imagine what your music would be like, how it would translate this complexity, this depth that I see in you." Something in his voice, in his gaze, made a sensitive chord vibrate in Eliza that she thought was extinguished, a desire for connection, for sharing, that surpassed simple friendship or artistic camaraderie. "I'll play for you tomorrow," she promised in a whisper. "Not as a professional pianist, but as a person seeking to rediscover why music is vital to her." He smiled, that smile that creased a dimple in his left cheek and illuminated his eyes with a particular glow. "I'll be there. What time?" 5 o'clock at my place after my lessons." He nodded, then in an impulsive gesture took her hand and brought it to his lips, in an old-fashioned hand kiss that might have seemed affected coming from another, but seemed perfectly natural from him. "Until tomorrow, then," he said softly. That night, Eliza slept peacefully for the first time in months. In the morning, she awoke with a new energy, a quiet determination that pleasantly surprised her students. With Amelia, she spent nearly an hour exploring different interpretations of the first movement of the Moonlight Sonata, encouraging her to find her own voice rather than imitating reference recordings. "The score is just a framework," she explained with a passion that surprised even herself. "It's up to you to give it life, to infuse it with your humanity, your emotions." Amelia looked at her with a mixture of wonder and confusion. "But how do I know if my interpretation is correct?" Eliza smiled, recognizing in this question her own past anxieties. "There is no correct or incorrect in art, Amelia. There is only honesty. Does what you play sincerely reflect what you feel? Does it come from you, or are you trying to reproduce something external?" At 5 o'clock sharp, Nathaniel knocked at her door. Eliza had spent the previous hour preparing the apartment, not frantically tidying as she would have done previously for professional visits, but creating an atmosphere conducive to musical intimacy. She had lit a few candles, slightly opened the windows to let in the fresh evening air, prepared tea, and taken out a bottle of red wine. "Welcome," she said, opening the door. "Come in." He looked around with curiosity, discovering her personal space for the first time. His eyes lingered on the framed photos on the wall, Eliza as a child at the piano, Eliza as a teenager receiving an award, adult Eliza on the stage of prestigious concert halls. "Your life in images," he observed softly. "Only a part," she corrected. "The public, visible part. There's another that I'm just beginning to rediscover." She invited him to sit in the small living room, but he remained standing, irresistibly attracted to the Mason and Hamlin that dominated the room. "It's magnificent," he murmured, brushing the polished black wood. "An instrument worthy of your talent." Eliza approached the piano, feeling a nervousness rise in her that she hadn't anticipated. It was different from the performance anxiety she knew so well, that fear of judgment, of technical failure. It was a deeper, more personal vulnerability, linked to truly revealing herself, without mask or armor. "What will you play?" asked Nathaniel, sitting in an armchair a few steps from the piano. "A personal composition to begin with," she replied, settling on the bench. "Then perhaps some Debussy." She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and placed her hands on the keyboard. The small impressionist waltz she had played for Gwendolen returned under her fingers, but this time with more assurance, more colors. She let the melody develop freely, improvising at times, discovering variations she had never explored before. Then, without stopping, she segued into Reflections in Water by Debussy, this piece that so perfectly evoked the movement of water, the play of light on a changing surface. Under her fingers, the music came alive with a fluidity, a freedom she had never dared to allow herself in concert, where the fear of deviating from the correct had always held her back. When the last note vanished in the air, Eliza kept her eyes closed for an instant, savoring the vibrant silence that follows music. Then she turned toward Nathaniel. He was looking at her with an overwhelming intensity, his eyes shining with contained emotion. "It was," he began, then broke off, as if words failed him. "It was you, Eliza. Completely, authentically you." This simple phrase touched her more deeply than all the technical praise she could have received in her career. He had heard not simply her performance, but her very being expressed through the music. "It's the first time in a long time that I've played without thinking about what others would expect," she admitted, "without trying to correspond to an image, to an impossible ideal." "And that's exactly why it was so beautiful," he replied, rising to approach her. "You weren't playing Debussy as he should be played according to academies and conservatories. You were playing Debussy as he resonates in you with your unique sensitivity, your history, your emotions." He sat beside her on the piano bench, their shoulders lightly touching. "It's what I try to do in my work, too," he continued. "Not simply reproduce techniques, established styles, but find my own voice. And it's the most difficult path because there's no instruction manual, no certainty." Eliza nodded, deeply understanding what he was expressing. "For all these years, I believed that perfection was the goal," she confessed, "playing without a single wrong note, scrupulously respecting the composer's indications, impressing with my technique. But that's not music. That's not art. What is it then?" he asked gently. She reflected for a moment, seeking the right words to express this revelation that was crystallizing within her. "It's a conversation," she said finally, "between the composer and the interpreter, between the interpreter and the listener, between the human soul and the mystery of existence. A conversation where each voice is unique and precious precisely because it is imperfect, because it carries the scars and hopes of a real life." Nathaniel looked at her with undisguised admiration. "That's exactly it," he agreed. "And that's what I heard in your playing just now. This authentic conversation, this voice that doesn't seek to hide behind technical perfection, but that dares to show itself vulnerable, human." A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with mutual understanding. Then, without warning, Nathaniel leaned toward her and kissed her, a gentle, almost timid kiss that carried all the admiration, all the tenderness he felt for her. When he pulled back, Eliza felt a warmth spread through her, a feeling of fullness she hadn't known for a long time, perhaps ever. I hadn't planned that, he murmured, suddenly uncertain. Neither had I, she replied with a smile. But some of the most beautiful things in life are those we don't plan, aren't they? That night they talked for hours about music, art, their respective journeys, their doubts, their hopes. An intimacy was weaving between them, made of mutual understanding and respect for the other's singularity. And when he left at the first light of dawn, Eliza knew that a new score was beginning to be written in her life, a work of which she didn't yet know all the notes, but whose melody promised to be richer, truer than anything she had played before. The days that followed unfolded in an almost unreal atmosphere for Eliza. The external world, the town preparing for Christmas, lessons at the conservatory, daily obligations, seemed slightly out of sync with the inner transformation she was experiencing. Each morning she sat at the piano, no longer with apprehension but with a renewed curiosity, rediscovering works she thought she knew by heart, exploring new ways of interpreting them, freed from the cage of the correct and the perfect. Her relationship with Nathaniel developed with the same quality of wonder and discovery. They saw each other almost every day, sometimes at the studio where she observed the birth of his lithographs, sometimes at her place where he listened to her play, offering not technical critiques, but sincere emotional reactions. What the music made him feel, the images it evoked in him. This constant dialogue between their respective arts nourished Eliza in a way she had never experienced. For the first time, she felt seen and heard not for her virtuosity or her fame, but for her humanity, her sensitivity, her unique voice. One evening, as they dined in a small restaurant in the historic center, nestled in a narrow alley where the Christmas lights reflected on the damp cobblestones, Nathaniel pulled from his bag a package carefully wrapped in artisanal paper. "An early gift," he said with a smile, handing it to her. "I wanted to give it to you before your parents arrive." Eliza delicately unwrapped it, discovering a series of lithographs bound in a small album. Opening the first page, she was overcome with emotion. Nathaniel had created a series of portraits of her at the piano, capturing different moments of her metamorphosis since her arrival in the Berkshires. The first showed her frozen, almost petrified before the instrument, her gaze haunted by fear. The last, in contrast, represented her in a state of grace, her face illuminated by a deep joy, a perfect communion with the music. "Is this how you see me?" she asked, moved by the precision with which he had captured her inner evolution. "It's how you are," he replied simply. "This rebirth, I've seen it day by day, like a photographer capturing the stages of a flower opening to the sun after a long winter." Eliza turned the pages with care, moved by this visual testimony of her journey. On the last page, Nathaniel had calligraphed a quote from Walt Whitman. "Music is the respiration of the soul, the language of what cannot be said, and without which it is impossible to live." "It's magnificent, Nathaniel. I don't know what to say." "Then say nothing," he smiled, taking her hand across the table. "Play it, when you're ready." The next day, her parents arrived from New York to spend the holidays with her. Eliza awaited them at the station with a mixture of apprehension and impatience. How would they perceive her now that she had changed so much? How to explain to them this transformation, this change of perspective on her career, on music, on her very life? When they descended from the train, her father elegant and straight despite his 65 years, her mother still graceful with that characteristic bearing of former dancers, Eliza was struck by the contrast between the image she had of them and their present reality. They seemed more vulnerable, more human than in her memories, where they often appeared as inflexible authority figures. The embraces were warm, almost clumsy in their emotional intensity. On the way to the apartment, the conversation remained superficial. The journey, the weather in New England, the Christmas preparations. But once settled in the living room, facing the Mason and Hamlin that occupied the space like a silent witness, her father directly broached the subject that concerned them all. "Elliot called us," he said without preamble. "He told us about Aspen, and your refusal." Eliza stiffened, ready to defend herself, but what followed surprised her. "He was furious," continued her father with an unexpected small smile. "He told us you were ruining your career, that you had lost your mind." "And what did you reply?" asked Eliza, uncertain. "That you were old enough to make your own decisions," intervened her mother, and that if this decision made you happy, it made us happy too. This response, so different from the reactions she had anticipated, completely caught Eliza off guard. All her life she had perceived her parents, especially her mother, as the first judges of her career, those whose approval was the hardest to obtain. "You're not disappointed?" she asked, incredulous. Her father and mother exchanged a look, as if they shared a secret. "Darling," began her mother, sitting beside her on the couch, "we made a mistake that many parents make with their talented children. We confused your gift with your identity. We believed that to be happy, you necessarily had to succeed according to conventional criteria. The great halls, the laudatory reviews, the international tours. What happened in New York," added her father, "it forced us to reflect, to ask ourselves if we hadn't, without wanting to, added to the unbearable pressure you already put on yourself." Eliza looked at them with astonishment, discovering a dimension of her parents she had never suspected, this capacity for questioning, for evolution, for deeper understanding. "I don't regret my musical education," she said softly. "I don't reproach you for anything. It was I who internalized this pressure, this obsession with perfection." "Perhaps," conceded her mother. "But we didn't watch sufficiently that the musician didn't stifle the woman in you." This word, woman, resonated strangely in Eliza's ears. Wasn't that precisely what she was rediscovering in the Berkshires? Not just a new approach to music, but a new way of inhabiting her life, of being fully human with all the complexities, contradictions, desires that implied. "I've met someone," she announced suddenly, surprised herself by this spontaneous confession. Her parents exchanged another look, in which this time could be read a benevolent curiosity. "His name is Nathaniel. He's a lithographer. He sees me differently, not as a pianist, but as a person. We would like to meet him," said her father simply, without a shadow of judgment in his voice. "He's invited us for Christmas Eve at his studio," she replied. "A small party with some friends. Warren Fletcher will be there too. And Gwendolyn Harrison." "Gwendolyn Harrison?" exclaimed her mother, impressed. "The pianist? She's in the Berkshires? She's rented a house for the holidays. We've become friends, I think. She's helped me a lot." That evening after dinner, Eliza did something she hadn't done since childhood. She played for her parents. Not a formal recital to demonstrate her progress or her virtuosity, but a moment of sincere musical sharing. She interpreted her small impressionist waltz, then some Chopin nocturnes. Finally, a free improvisation that evoked the New England landscapes, the changing light on the hills, the sense of pine and maple that permeated the air. When she finished, she saw that her mother was silently crying, those discreet tears that flow without altering the beauty of the face. Her father, usually so reserved, seemed deeply moved too. "It's different," he said finally. "You're playing. It has a soul it didn't have before, a freedom." "That's what I'm seeking now," explained Eliza. "No longer technical perfection, but emotional authenticity. No longer to impress, but to touch." Her mother delicately wiped her tears with a lace handkerchief. "That's exactly what dance was for me before it became a profession, an obligation," she said softly. "A language to express what words cannot say." This conversation marked a turning point in Eliza's relationship with her parents. For the first time, they were speaking as adults, without the power dynamics and expectations that had characterized their interactions for so many years. In the following days, they explored together the Berkshires and its surroundings, the Christmas markets that perfumed the air with cinnamon and orange, the New England nativity scenes with their colorful characters, the perched villages of Stockbridge and Great Barrington, where the golden stones seemed to capture and reflect the winter light. Eliza showed them Nathaniel's studio, presenting them with a new pride that had nothing to do with social status or conventional success. And when Christmas Eve arrived, Palmer Studios transformed by twinkling garlands, by branches of holly and mistletoe, by candles that danced in the light breeze, Eliza felt invaded by a deep gratitude. Around the large table improvised with printing boards and trestles were gathered the beings who had accompanied her rebirth, her parents who were discovering a new way of being family, Warren Fletcher who had offered her this haven in the Berkshires, Gwendolyn Harrison whose wisdom had illuminated her path, and of course Nathaniel, whose patient love had helped her rediscover herself. Around midnight, while conversations and laughter filled the studio, Nathaniel approached her with 2 glasses of champagne. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, handing her a glass. Eliza smiled, contemplating this living tableau that represented her new life. "I'm thinking about music," she replied. "Not the kind played on stage to impress an anonymous audience, but the kind created together, day after day, by living fully, loving without reserve, accepting our humanity with all its imperfections." Nathaniel raised his glass, his blue eyes shining in the candlelight. "To harmony, then," he proposed, "in all its forms." Their glasses clinked softly, like crystalline notes in a composition that was just beginning. January brought to the Berkshires a dry cold that made the air transparent as crystal. The bare maples of Main Street stretched their black branches toward a sky of an almost painful blue, and the town fountain adorned itself each morning with ephemeral ice sculptures that melted at the first rays of the sun. The town seemed suspended in a tranquil waiting, as if holding its breath before the spring awakening. For Eliza, this beginning of the year marked a crucial stage in her rebirth. The faculty concert was approaching, scheduled for January 25th, and with it her official return to the stage, even if it was in a setting quite different from the great international halls to which she had been accustomed. Her parents had returned to New York after the holidays, themselves transformed by these 2 weeks spent together in the Berkshires. They had discovered a new way of relating to their daughter, no longer as the demanding mentors of a prodigy, but as the benevolent witnesses of a woman in full reinvention of herself. "We'll come back for your concert," her mother had promised, kissing her on the station platform. "Not like before to verify that you're perfect, but simply to see you happy in your music." This simple phrase summarized all the transformation that had taken place in their relationship. Preparation for the concert now occupied an important part of Eliza's days. She had decided to interpret 3 pieces: her own composition, the small impressionist waltz that had marked the beginning of her healing, Debussy's Reflections in Water, which she was rediscovering with a new freedom, and a more daring choice, Chopin's Sonata No. 3, this monumental work she had never dared to play in public despite her love for it, judging it too personal, too revealing. Each morning, before her lessons, she worked for 2 hours. Not in the rehearsal room of the conservatory as her colleagues would have done, but in her home, on her Mason and Hamlin, in the intimacy of her apartment, where she felt free to explore, to test, to make mistakes without external judgment. Sometimes Nathaniel listened to her, sitting silently in a corner, sketching her expression as she played, capturing on paper this communion between the musician and her instrument. One morning, as she finished the 4th movement of Chopin's sonata, she noticed he had tears in his eyes. "What is it?" she asked, concerned. "Nothing," he replied, discreetly wiping his cheeks. "It's just, when you play like that, I see your soul, completely, without veil, without protection. It's overwhelming." This observation struck her deeply. It was precisely what she was seeking now, no longer to hide behind dazzling technique, but to reveal herself through music, in all her vulnerability, her complexity, her truth. "Do you think the audience will perceive it too?" she asked, suddenly anxious at the idea of this exposure. "Those who know how to listen, yes," he replied simply. "The others will hear only beautiful notes, but it's not for them that you play now, is it?" He was right, of course. She no longer played to satisfy external expectations, to obtain the approval of critics or the admiration of the audience. She played to express something that came from the depths of herself, to share a human experience that surpassed words. This new perspective profoundly transformed her relationship with stage fright, with the performance anxiety that had so paralyzed her. The fear was still there. How could it be otherwise after the trauma she had experienced? But it had changed in nature. It was no longer the terror of failure, of judgment, of humiliation. It was rather the sacred apprehension of one who prepares to share something deeply intimate, to bare oneself before the other. A week before the concert, Warren Fletcher invited her to his office after her lessons. He looked concerned, which immediately worried Eliza. "Is there a problem with the concert?" she asked, sitting across from him. "No, not at all," he reassured her. "On the contrary, the news that you would be playing has spread, and we have let's say, a small logistical challenge." He handed her a list of registrations. The room planned for the faculty concert could accommodate about 100 people, generally students and their families, but the list included nearly 200 names. "It would seem your reputation has preceded you," explained Warren with a smile. "Music lovers from all over the region have learned that the celebrated Eliza Bradford would be playing, and they want to be present." This news caught her by surprise. In her Berkshire bubble, she had almost forgotten that she was still, for the outside world, that prodigy pianist whose career had abruptly derailed. "What will we do?" she asked, torn between flattery and concern. "We have two options," replied Warren. "Either strictly limit registrations, which risks creating disappointments, or move the concert to a larger venue." He paused, watching her carefully to gauge her reaction. "Tanglewood would be available," he added. "It can accommodate 400 people." Tanglewood, this historic hall in the heart of the Berkshires, with its amphitheater architecture, its boxes adorned with gilt, its exceptional acoustics. A real concert hall, not simply a conservatory auditorium. Eliza felt her heart accelerate. It was a significant change of scale, dangerously bringing this intimate concert closer to the professional performances she had fled. The risk of falling back into her old patterns, the pressure, the paralyzing anxiety, was real. "I understand if you prefer to stay in a more restricted setting," added Warren, seeing her hesitation. "It's up to you to decide." Eliza remained silent for a moment, inwardly weighing the options. Then a thought came to her, a reflection that Gwendolen had shared during their last meeting. Fear never completely disappears. Art isn't eliminating fear, but learning to dance with it. Tanglewood, she finally decided, but on one condition. Which? That the program doesn't mention my past, my prizes, my former prestigious venues, just my name and the pieces I'll play. I want to be perceived as any conservatory professor, not as a fallen star making her comeback. Warren nodded, perfectly understanding her request. "It shall be done," he promised. "Just your name and your music, nothing else." Leaving Warren's office, Eliza felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension rise within her. Tanglewood. It was a challenge she hadn't anticipated, but perhaps it was precisely what she needed, not to hide in an ultra-protected setting, but to test her new approach to music in a context that more closely resembled her previous life. She went directly to Palmer Studios to announce the news to Nathaniel. On the way, she passed by the concert hall, this elegant building set in the midst of a large park, with its facade in the style of a Greek temple. She paused for a moment, imagining the interior filled with spectators come to hear her, no longer as the impeccable virtuoso she had tried to be, but as the authentic artist she was becoming. Nathaniel was in full work mode when she arrived, inking a lithographic stone with precise gestures that betrayed years of practice. He looked up and smiled, seeing her, wiping his ink-stained hands on a cloth. "You look different," he observed immediately. "What happened?" She told him about her conversation with Warren, the change of venue, her decision to accept this new challenge. "Tanglewood," mused Nathaniel. "It's a magnificent hall. I attended a Baroque lute concert there last year. The acoustics are exceptional." He approached her and took her hands in his, examining them as if reading a story there. "Aren't you afraid?" he asked gently. "Yes, of course," she admitted straightforwardly. "But it's no longer the same fear as before. It's no longer the terror of being judged insufficient, of not corresponding to an idealized image. It's rather the apprehension of truly revealing oneself, of sharing something authentically personal." He nodded, perfectly understanding this nuance. "It's the same fear I feel when I exhibit my most personal works," he confessed. "Not the fear of technical criticism, but that of being truly seen, with all my weaknesses, my obsessions, my doubts. It's a much deeper vulnerability, but also much more fertile artistically." Eliza smiled, touched by this confession that so perfectly reflected her own feelings. "I think that's exactly what true art is," she murmured. "This capacity to transform our vulnerability into creative strength, to share not an inaccessible perfection, but our imperfect and authentic humanity." The days that followed were intense. Eliza visited Tanglewood with Warren, absorbing the particular acoustics of this historic place, slightly adapting her playing to fully inhabit this larger space. She now practiced every day, not with the obsessive drive of old, but with a serene concentration, a deep listening to herself. 3 days before the concert, Gwendolyn Harrison came to hear her play the entirety of her program. The legendary pianist sat at the back of the empty hall, silent and attentive, while Eliza successively interpreted her impressionist waltz, Debussy's Reflections in Water, then the monumental Chopin Sonata No. 3. When the last note died away, Gwendolyn remained silent for a long time, as if to let the music fully resonate within her. Then she slowly approached the piano, her face illuminated by contained emotion. "My dear," she finally said, "you are ready. More than ready. You have found your voice." Eliza felt a warmth spread through her, not the vain satisfaction of the past when faced with compliments, but a deep, almost spiritual joy at having been truly heard. "I still have so far to go," she responded humbly. "We all have an endless road ahead of us," agreed Gwendolyn. "That's what makes art beautiful. There is no final destination, no absolute perfection to reach, only an ongoing dialogue between what we are and what we might become." She took Eliza's hands in hers, those hands that had interpreted the greatest masterpieces on the most prestigious stages of the world. "Do you know what's wonderful about your playing now? You no longer seek to impress, but to touch. You no longer play to prove your worth, but to share your humanity. It's infinitely more powerful." These words remained with Eliza like a blessing, accompanying her in the final preparations for the concert. The eve of the big day, she stayed home, refusing even Nathaniel's visit, needing this moment of solitude to center herself, to commune one last time with these works in the intimacy of her apartment. That evening, she wrote at length in her journal, reflecting on the path traveled since that fateful evening at Carnegie Hall that had seemed to mark the end of her career, but which, in hindsight, had been the beginning of a necessary liberation. She now understood that what had broken in New York wasn't her music, but the cage in which she had enclosed it, this obsessive quest for technical perfection that had progressively stifled her authentic voice. January 25th arrived clear and cold. From the morning, Eliza felt a particular energy inhabit her, not the devouring anxiety of old, but a quiet excitement, an almost joyful impatience to share what she had discovered through her musical rebirth. She spent the day in a carefully established routine, a long walk through the streets of the town to oxygenate her body and mind, a light meal, a short rest, then an hour of meditation to fully connect with her interiority. She didn't touch the piano even once, trusting the memory of her fingers, the intelligence of her body. When the time came to prepare, she chose a simple but elegant dress, a long midnight blue velvet dress without frills or excessive décolleté that would allow her to move freely at the piano without visual distraction for the audience. Her hair gathered in a soft chignon, minimal makeup, no jewelry except the small treble clef pendant that Nathaniel had given her the day before, a discreet symbol of their connection. Nathaniel came to get her at 7 p.m., moving in his dark suit that she had never seen him wear before. In the car that was taking them to the concert hall, he respected her need for silence, contenting himself with holding her hand in his thumb gently caressing her palm in a reassuring gesture. Arriving at the artist's entrance, Eliza was welcomed by Warren Fletcher, visibly moved to see her so serene, so present on the eve of this crucial moment. "The hall is full," he informed her. "All your students are there, in the front row. Your parents have just arrived and—" He hesitated as if fearing her reaction. "And Curtis Thornton is in the audience," he concluded. Eliza felt her heart skip a beat. Curtis Thornton, the celebrated music critic whose sharp pen had so cruelly lacerated her after her failure in New York. What was he doing here, in the Berkshires, for a simple faculty concert? "He heard about your rebirth," explained Warren, reading the question in her eyes. "He came out of curiosity, I suppose, or perhaps to finish the job." This news could have completely destabilized her a few months earlier. Now, strangely, she accepted it with a tranquility that surprised even herself. Curtis Thornton was just one voice among others, important in the musical world, certainly, but no longer determinant for her own value as an artist, as a human being. "Let him listen," she said simply. "I no longer play for critics." In the small dressing room that had been assigned to her, Eliza took a few moments of complete solitude before the concert. Seated in front of the mirror, she contemplated her reflection, not to check her appearance, but to connect one last time with herself, with this new woman she had become in the Berkshires, with this authentic artist who had emerged from the ashes of the virtuoso obsessed with perfection. At 8 p.m. sharp, she heard the 3 traditional knocks announcing the beginning of the show. Her heart accelerated, but her breathing remained deep, controlled. She closed her eyes for an instant, visualizing not the performance to come, but the pure joy of playing, of communion with music, of sharing something authentically human. Then she rose and left the dressing room, ready to face no longer an audience to conquer, but human beings to touch, to move, to make vibrate with her in this shared experience that is live music. The moment had come to write a new chapter in her artistic life, not a restoration of what had been lost, but the creation of something new, truer, more deeply musical. 5 years had passed since that January evening at Tanglewood, which had marked not Eliza Bradford's return to the stage, but the emergence of a transformed artist, reborn from her own ashes like a musical phoenix. On this spring morning, the New England light flooded Palmer Studios, transformed over the years into a hybrid space where now coexisted Nathaniel's lithographic presses and a magnificent grand piano, no longer the Mason and Hamlin from the Berkshire apartment, but a new Steinway chosen with care for its particular sonority, warm and deep, which perfectly matched the special acoustics of this old building with stone walls. Eliza was seated at a small table near the window, rereading the proofs of her first book, Echoes and Resonances, Reflections on Music and Artistic Authenticity, that her publisher had just sent her for final validation. The volume, which alternated autobiographical narrative and philosophical meditations on the art of interpretation, had already aroused considerable interest in the musical world well before its official publication. A smile brushed her lips when she reread the preface signed by Gwendolyn Harrison, who had become over the years not only her mentor, but her closest friend in the musical world. There are 2 types of artists: those who seek technical perfection as an end in itself, and those who understand that technique is only a means in service of a deeper, more authentically human expression. Eliza Bradford had the rare courage to pass from the first group to the second, traversing for this a valley of shadow that would have definitively broken many musicians. This book recounts this crossing and offers us in sharing the precious lessons she has drawn from it, not as dogmatic truths, but as invitations to reflection, to the search for our own authentic voice. These words touched her deeply, not out of vanity, but because they expressed exactly what she had tried to accomplish in these past years, not to rebuild a career according to conventional standards of success, but to reinvent her relationship with music and the audience. The Tanglewood concert had been a turning point, quite different from what she might have imagined. She still remembered that strange sensation when she entered the stage that evening. Not the familiar terror, but a subtle mixture of excitement and serenity, as if she were exactly where she should be, doing exactly what she was born to do. She had played differently that evening, with a freedom, an authenticity she had never dared to grant herself before. The notes were the same as those written on the scores, but the spirit animating them was transformed. No longer the virtuosic demonstration of a perfect technique, but the sincere expression of a soul that had traversed darkness and returned with a new light. The audience had felt it, this transformation. The ovation that had followed her performance wasn't the polite, conventional one that rewards a technically successful performance. It was a wave of pure emotion, an authentic exchange between human beings who, for an instant, had vibrated in unison through the mystery of music. Even Curtis Thornton, the dreaded critic, had been touched. His review, published 2 days later in the Musical Echo, had surprised the entire musical world by its unusually humble, almost confessional tone. I had come to the Berkshires with the unacknowledged intention of witnessing the definitive fall of an already quite dimmed star. I leave transformed by the encounter with an artist who had the courage to lose everything in order to better find herself. What I heard at Tanglewood wasn't a demonstration of virtuosity, though the technique is undeniably present, but something much rarer and more precious. An authentic voice which no longer seeks to impress but to communicate, which no longer aims for perfection but for truth. In an increasingly standardized musical world, formatted by international competitions and market expectations, Eliza Bradford reminds us what music is at its most essential level, not a product to consume, but a human experience to share. This review, much more than praise, had been a validation of her new path, not a return to the status quo, but the affirmation that another way was possible in the musical world. The following years had seen Eliza progressively develop this new approach to her career. She hadn't sought to regain the great international halls and exhausting tours, preferring to focus on projects that truly mattered to her. She had continued to teach at the Berkshire Conservatory, but with a transformed approach, encouraging her students to develop their own voice rather than conform to academic standards. Her masterclasses, at first at a local scale, then increasingly in demand internationally, were distinguished by their focus on emotional authenticity rather than mere technical perfection. In parallel, she had begun to give recitals in intimate settings, private salons, small provincial halls, exclusive festivals, favoring venues with exceptional acoustics and direct contact with a receptive audience. These concerts, limited to about 10 per year to preserve her quality of life, had become sought-after events, not for their social prestige but for the intensity of the musical experience they offered. She had also developed a unique collaboration with Nathaniel, mixing music and visual arts in performances where her piano interpretations dialogued with her companion's lithographic creations, projected in real time, creating a synesthetic experience that deeply touched the spectators. For Nathaniel had become much more than a friend or an ally in her artistic rebirth. Their relationship had deepened naturally, without rush or calculation, founded on a mutual understanding of their creative journeys and their shared vulnerabilities. They had married 2 years earlier, in an intimate ceremony at the foot of Monument Mountain, surrounded only by their close ones. Her parents, transformed by this new relationship with their daughter, Warren Fletcher, and his wife, Gwendolyn Harrison, radiant as a witness, and some artist friends met over the years in the Berkshires. They had chosen to live and work together in this enlarged studio, refusing the artificial separation between personal life and artistic creation, building day by day an existence where love and art nourished each other, where authenticity was the central value, as much in their human relations as in their creative expressions. A slight movement near the piano drew Eliza's attention, pulling her from her reflections. Their 8-month-old daughter Lily had just awakened in the little cradle installed in the shadow of the Steinway. Blue eyes like her father's, already intensely curious, scrutinized the world with that particular gravity of infants. Eliza put down her manuscript and approached the cradle, delicately taking her daughter in her arms. As each time she held this little being against her heart, she experienced an emotion that surpassed all she had been able to express in music. This unconditional love, this primitive connection that transcended any form of art or language. "Good morning, my treasure," she murmured, kissing the delicate forehead. "Did you sleep well? Did you have beautiful dreams?" The studio door opened, letting in Nathaniel, his arms laden with fresh bread and fruit for their breakfast. His face lit up seeing his wife and daughter near the piano. "My 2 muses are awake," he said, putting down his purchases on the table. "I met the mailman. You've received a letter from Japan." He handed her an envelope whose address was calligraphed with an elegance that immediately betrayed its origin. Eliza recognized it at once. It was the response from the Tokyo Conservatory to her proposal of a masterclass on emotional authenticity in the interpretation of the romantic repertoire, a project particularly dear to her heart. "Do you want to open it?" asked Nathaniel, curious. "Later," she replied, gently rocking Lily. "This moment is too precious to be interrupted." He smiled, perfectly understanding this hierarchy of priorities that had naturally established itself in their life. Music, art were essential, but secondary to these moments of human connection, these moments of pure presence that gave their true meaning to existence. Approaching them, he delicately embraced Eliza and their daughter, forming a living tableau that summarized all they had built together, this rare balance between artistic creation and embodied love, between personal expression and communion with the other. "I was thinking of something," he said softly. "Do you remember that first time you played for me, right here, on that old out-of-tune piano of my grandmother's? That lullaby so simple but so moving." Eliza nodded, touched by this founding memory. "You could arrange it for Lily," he suggested. "Make it a special piece, just for her. Something she'll keep all her life as a musical heritage, a testimony of these first months when she fell asleep to the sound of your music." The idea deeply touched her. It would be a perfect way to transmit to their daughter not the obsession with performance and recognition that had nearly destroyed her, but the conception of music as a language of the soul, as an authentic expression of love and human connection she had finally discovered. "I'll start today," she promised. "It will be my gift for her first birthday." Later that morning, after having fed and dressed Lily, Eliza settled at the piano. The letter from Japan, opened in the meantime, had brought a positive response, an invitation for next autumn, with carte blanche to organize her masterclass as she intended. A few years earlier, such an opportunity would have filled her with a feverish ambition, a determination to prove her worth on the international stage. Today she welcomed it with a quiet joy, as an occasion to share what she had learned, to contribute in her way to the evolution of the musical world toward more authenticity and less performative obsession. But for the moment, this future project remained in the background of her consciousness. All her attention was concentrated on this lullaby she wanted to create for Lily, not a work destined to impress critics or demonstrate her virtuosity, but a pure expression of this unconditional love, this deep connection that transcended any form of art or language. Her fingers caressed the keys, naturally finding a simple and luminous melody that seemed to evoke her daughter's curious gaze, discovering the world. Her little warm body nestled against her chest, her first smiles that illuminated the entire universe. Nathaniel had sat on the carpet with Lily, playing gently with her while the music filled the studio with its living presence. The little girl raised her head, attentive, as if she already recognized that these notes were for her, that they told her story, her entry into a world where art wasn't a demonstration of technical superiority, but a celebration of life in all its complexity, its imperfect beauty. Observing her family while playing, Eliza was seized by a gratitude so intense that it brought tears to her eyes. What had seemed to be the end, that catastrophic evening at Carnegie Hall, had been only the beginning of a journey toward a deeper understanding of art, of love, of life itself. The music, now being born under her fingers, carried all the scars, all the lessons, all the joys of this journey traveled. It wasn't technically perfect according to academic standards, but it was deeply true, an authentic expression of a soul that had traversed darkness and returned with a new light, softer, warmer, more human. It was, she realized with sudden clarity, exactly what she had always sought through music, even in the times when she lost herself in the obsessive quest for technical perfection, this capacity to touch the other beyond words, to create a bridge between human solitudes, to transform individual experience into shared communion. The melody concluded naturally, like a breath finding its rest. The silence that followed wasn't empty, but full, of presence, of love, of infinite possibilities. "It was magnificent," murmured Nathaniel, holding Lily, who was looking at her mother with an almost supernatural intensity. Eliza smiled, grateful for this perfect moment in its very imperfection, for this life that was no longer defined by the search for external successes, but by the fullness of each moment, lived with awareness, in presence, in truth. "Yes," she replied simply. "Life is magnificent."